And there we go. All right, lovely.
Right. Well, are we now starting, Paul?
We are starting. Is that okay?
Well, if anybody is like me out there, they probably want to. They're thinking, "What the hell is that above his head?" So that's a Gustav Klimt. No, I'm telling a lie. It's Egon Schiele. It's a portrait of his mistress Volley. So everybody can relax now. They now know. And there's some nice pictures of New York.
Lovely. Andrew, in that case, how important is art to you? Before we go into writing or anything like that, how important is art?
Visual art.
Mm.
That's a great question because I write comics these days, graphic novels. I co-write them with Ben Aronovich, a name who's familiar to Doctor Who fans. We're doing the Rivers of London comics, which are in the world of his best-selling novels, Rivers of London series. And when I write the comics, I always have a very strong visual sense of what I want on the page, and I give quite elaborate descriptions for the artist. And I don't mind if they depart from them, but as long as they improve on what I've said. But I always do that. I never just leave it to the artist. And I was thinking the other day that I've been doing graphic novels for a long time now, but I didn't acquire this through the practice of writing comic scripts. I've always had it. I've always had a strong visual sense and a love of art. I mean, when I was a kid, I was looking at things like, well, to be relevant, Doctor Who annuals. There was a Dalek annual. I think it had sort of an orange cover. Anyway, that's stunning piece of art. And so I was always drawn to those things. You know, the paintings that my parents had on their walls, not originals, but they had a Vermeer, you know, which had that lovely pearly light. And so these were the kind of things that go into your head when you're a little chap and have a tremendous effect. And I was reading comics ever since I was a nipper, obviously. And even in those days, I think, oh, here's one by the good artist. There's another one by that crappy artist. So I've always had a love of illustration, of visuals, and I suppose a kind of gift for appreciating it and knowing what was good, but not for doing it myself. I can't draw for toffee.
So when do you think you first became artistically aware of art as being something that could bring pleasure and something that you were excited about and wanted to be a part of?
Well, I can tell you when that impulse in me began to be killed. It was when I went to school and they started teaching art in a very formal kind of way, and that took all the fun out of it. I mean, I just loved going in those days, the drugstore and buying the comic books and the paperbacks with fantastic covers. So I would say that was just something that was there in some fashion from birth, and it gradually moved from sort of a completely unspoken childhood thing into sort of a more formal awareness. Like I was buying the Doc Savage paperbacks, which had fantastic cover art by James Bama, but occasionally there'd be a dud by somebody else, or the Conan novels, perhaps more familiar to our audience, which had almost all of them had Frazetta covers, except for a couple of real dogs, which had covers by somebody else. And it's not as though, as a kid, there's any chance of being fooled. You could instantly see who was the good artist, who was the bad artist. And it's just, I don't know, it's just one of the great pleasures in life. And it's just something I imagine that was wired into my brain, which was encouraged because I was lucky enough to be living in a time when I could see all these pieces of art. I mean, you walk into a bookshop in those days and every paperback cover or every album cover in a record shop was a work of art. But, you know, if I'd been born 1,000 years earlier, I might only have seen a stained glass window if I was lucky. So I think people have these abilities. It's just a case of whether they're living in a world where they can flower.
And did school, I mean, if school maybe didn't allow the visual artist in you to flourish, did school encourage you in other ways artistically?
Well, the thing about writing is they're just, in English class, they'd assign you to write a short story, and I'd write a short story, and they'd say, "Oh, look, did you really write that? You can tell us the truth. Did you really write that?" Yes, I did. Yeah, so that was always fun. The love of libraries was with me ever since my mum first took me to a library when I was about 5 years old and took a Robert Heinlein book off the shelf. And if anybody's a science fiction fan of science fiction prose, Heinlein's a god.
And at the time, so because you were born in London and then moved to Canada.
Oh, you've done your research, Paul.
Yes, and then moved back. So I'm wondering, your artistic voice when you're writing, the voice in your head, would you say it's more of a Canadian voice or a British voice?
I can adapt to the circumstance. We were talking just before we started recording about me writing some stage plays. So I wrote one that was it's set in England in the 1920s, and it was sort of Noel Coward, P.G. Wodehouse territory, and I got the language of that fairly accurate. And then immediately after that, I wrote a detective story, private eye story set in Los Angeles in the 50s, and I got the language of that pretty damn accurate too. Although one of the actors who's American said, "You use this phrase going around the houses," which means to sort of approach something in a circuitous way. And he said nobody in America would ever say that. I thought, right. So I said, okay, beat around the bush, which is what an American might say. Don't beat around the bush. Come to the point. Don't go around the houses. But I do occasionally slip up. I occasionally don't know which country it came from. In that same play, I had a bit where the guy said, "Oh, I'm a bit shaky on my pins," meaning his legs. And I suddenly realized that was actually Cockney rhyming slang, pins and pegs for legs. But, so I caught that one myself, and I changed it to gams, which is an archaic kind of American expression for legs. But so I do have to be careful about that. So, but I'd say my voice is firmly rooted in the middle of the Atlantic.
Right. And when you're writing, do you hear the lines in the characters' voices in your head?
No, I hear the lines in my voice in my head. And like to the extent that sometimes I find I've written something down and I haven't written the word I meant. I've written something that's homonym. It's something that sounds the same. I'm just, because I'm in a hurry, I was distracted. So it's very much, I do actually hear the word spoken in my head, in a non-antipsychotic requiring kind of way.
So, and it was at school that you first became aware that maybe you had a gift for language, was it?
I just loved reading. I loved reading. And I sort of wanted to be a writer in a really abstract way. Like I remember writing out a whole list of titles of novels I was going to write. But I never actually got around. I just assumed I'd be a writer. I never actually did any writing except when forced to by an assignment at school. I know some writers, were busily scribbling away since they were kids. Like Stephen King wrote his own short horror story and took it to school and sold it, made a lot of money before it was banned and he was made to give everybody their money back. But I was never doing stuff like that. I just loved reading and just thought, I want to be a writer. I will be a writer. But I don't really want to do any work but to get there. So it wasn't until I left university that I took a serious crack at writing.
Mm-hmm. But there was a choice there, wasn't there, with careers? Because wasn't there also an involvement with computers and IT?
Well, what happened was, rightly or wrongly, I was very good at English, and I could have probably got into a very good English course at a terrific university. But I thought, what kind of job can I get with an English degree? I mean, it might help with my writing, but I don't really think it would, because they don't teach creative writing, do they? I'd be studying other people's writing. And so I thought, I want to get a job that will fit me I want to do a course that will allow me to get a well-paying job. So I've got something to fall back on. So I studied computer science at university. And I did get a very good, very highly paying job at a cutting-edge firm in Cambridge. But what I hadn't reckoned with was my heart wasn't in it. Like everything I did was sensible, in terms of the head, it all made perfect sense. But in terms of the heart, it was completely the wrong move. So I would have been better off doing an English course or maybe English and drama and meeting people and networking and meeting people in the world that I wanted to move into. Whereas I found myself with a degree and a very good job that I didn't particularly like. But luckily, at that exact moment, before they found me out, I was headhunted for Doctor Who. So, I landed on my feet.
Yeah. But before you got Doctor Who, though, you got an agent, didn't you, first?
Yeah. So what happened was when I went to university, and I was sort of thinking all the time, excuse me, I'm going to be a writer, but it might help to write something. Mm-hmm. Now, at some point around I guess when I was at university, somewhere around that time, I did write my first novel, and I sent it off. There's a competition. That's what got me to write my first novel. So I sent it into the competition. And to my abiding surprise, I didn't win. I'm still surprised. I just thought, this isn't the way it's supposed to work. I write it, I send it in, I win. Obviously, this was the way it was supposed to be. And I remember when it came back in its brown jiffy bag, thinking, hang on, this is not going the way it's supposed to go. Like, I was really upset. And then what happened was I sort of tootled along, continued in my own happy, hippie kind of way. Then my father died, and that was a wake up call. I thought, okay, I mean, there's nothing like that for making you reassess your life. So I'd finished university at that point. I was in my early 20s, and my father died. And I thought, okay, look, if I'm going to be a writer, I've got to get my act together. So I started writing really, and I thought, okay, here's the way to do it. I want to write novels, but writing novels takes a long time, and it's difficult. Like my novel didn't win the competition, so it may not be easy. So how am I going to earn a living while I'm doing that without falling back on doing something boring like computing? So I thought, I know, I'll write for television because it'll be much quicker to write television scripts and obviously much easier to break in. This is what I thought at the moment, in my naivety. So I got a hold of a book, actually a very good book within its limitations, called Writing for Television, by a chap called Malcolm Hulke, who I didn't know then, but I would learn was a major Doctor Who stalwart and also a big-time commie. So, interesting threads of his career. And so I bought this book, and back in the day, I also bought, because I was very methodical, but I bought what was then called, and people listening to this won't have any idea what I'm talking about. I bought a typewriter. And it wasn't even an electric typewriter, it was an electronic typewriter, which meant it was almost getting towards being a word processor. I mean, it wasn't a word processor. Here's what it did. You would type a line, and it would appear in a little tiny line on a little screen on the machine, and you could fix it before you push the button, and it typed on the page. So this was like people out there thinking, my God, why didn't he just use clay tablets? But at the time, this was sort of the best thing that you could do, because we didn't have word processors yet. So it was the best compromise between a Stone Age old-fashioned steam typewriter and what would eventually become a word processor. So I got this machine, and I had this book. So I had the means, I had information about how to do TV scripts. I had a machine for typing them on, and I had loads of ideas. And so I just wrote a whole bunch of TV scripts. And in those days, television was just reaching the end of a kind of a golden age when you had what you call plays on television, which means one-off stories. They're not part of a series or a serial. You could just write a one-off thing like a mini movie. And there was a huge appetite for them, huge market for them. That was just beginning to end in those days. But the great thing about those is you didn't have to write a spec script for Holby City, right? You could write anything you wanted, and there was actually a place where it might happen. They were still doing these one-off plays, and very good they were too, some of them. They started calling them films, and they got a bit more elaborate, and then they sort of ceased to be. But anyway, I wrote maybe a dozen of these things, and I had a chart. And I had a chart with the titles of the scripts I'd written and the places I'd sent them to, and kept track of things. And when it would come, a play would come back, and I'd send it somewhere else. And quite rapidly, I started getting not just standard rejection slips, but personalized ones saying, "This doesn't work for us, but you show talent," or other things like that, which is incredibly valuable at that stage in your career. Like I wish I could personally thank all the people who took the trouble to do that, because that really helped keep me going.
Have you a theory as to why that golden age of television came to an end? Because you're right, that the single play was a wonderful thing, and if you look at the work of some people like Harold Pinter, there's some of the work that he wrote in the early 60s for Associated Rediffusion. I think he wrote The Lover for them. It's a beautiful piece of work. And you could see so much new material, rehearsed material as well, every single week. And it did come to an end around then. Do you have a theory as to why? Or?
Well, no, but thinking about it now, I think we got involved in the meretricious pursuit of ratings. And you will always get more people to tune in, I believe, to a running serial, to something that keeps coming back every week. You can build up more of an audience. And people love the same kind of thing. I mean, that soap operas are kind of the lowest common denominator example of that. but right up to things like Game of Thrones, which I adore.
Mm.
But people tune in to see the same characters, and that's what you don't get with a play. And I would suspect that might be what did for the poor old play.
Mm.
But it was a wonderful proving ground, not just for writers but for directors, and it really was a golden age. I mean, they might look a bit, they wouldn't actually look that dodgy now. They just look like maybe a little bit set bound, I think. Because they, as a rule, they weren't doing things, ambitious things with effects like Doctor Who did. So they wouldn't have that kind of problem. But they probably would look a bit studio bound.
Mm. So you've got an agent by this point, and then
sorry, that was where your question came from. Yeah, so I was sending out all these scripts.
Yeah.
And I didn't get any sales, but what I did get is I got invited into the BBC, which then had something called the script unit, run by a lovely man called Tony Dinner, and he would invite you in, and there'd be a bunch of other aspiring writers who had also reached their attention, they felt deserved encouragement. Tony, you then discovered rapidly you were in a holding area that nobody was going to hire you at the BBC and give you a script, even though you're already there in a sense. They all wanted to work. Everybody always wants a professional writer who's already got experience, right? Already got credits. But this was great. It encouraged you, and it was wonderful for networking. And when I was there, I met a guy called Malcolm Cole, who would crop up again in the Doctor Who story of me. And Malcolm, I told him what I was doing, sending these scripts out to all the TV companies. He said, well, you do know you can send those scripts to an agent and get an agent. I thought, oh, you could. I thought you only got an agent if you sold something. He said, no, and they can help you sell something. So that's how I got my agent, Richard Wakely, lovely man at Fraser and Dunlop, as it was then. It's now called Peters, Fraser and Dunlop, still a big time agency. So I'd written a bunch of scripts, and I wrote one script which I was aware would be a breakthrough script because it was a really hard hitting thriller about something called telephone sex, which again, our audience will be scratching their heads thinking, what's telephone sex? Because it was something that before the internet, it was this kind of thing where people would ring up and a woman, it was almost always a woman, would talk dirty to them. And the thing is, I always had this vision of the woman with this really sexy voice saying all these dirty things. You know, she's actually some nanny doing her knitting. So it was this duality, the unreality, the sense that they create a persona on the telephone that is not them. And I thought, well, what if some psycho killer falls in love with the personality that this woman's projecting? So it's a really good idea. And it was a really good, hard-hitting script. My girlfriend at the time read it and said, this is great, but nobody will make this because it was too much. And nobody would make it, but what it did is it attracted a lot of attention. It got me my agent. So that was my breakthrough script.
And somewhere here, I presume, Doctor Who comes in.
Well, what happened was I was trying to sell these scripts, and I'd got an agent, and he actually sold a couple scripts in the sense that they were optioned. They never got made, but I got some money, and then nothing happened. Nothing. And I thought, okay, this is it. I've had my little adventure of being a writer. I'm going to have to face reality and use that computer science degree. So I sort of brushed up my credentials, and I got a gig, very good job, as I mentioned, in Cambridge. A really lovely company, full of lovely kind of hippie, alternative lifestyle kind of people. But they were all really good at this job, and they were all really into it. And I thought one day they'll find out that they've got this cuckoo in the nest, because I was just like, I like the money, they're nice people, it's great, but I don't really get it. I'm not really into it. I can just about keep up and do the work, but I don't give a fuck. If you'll excuse my French. So that was the position I was in. I was sort of aware that I was living this false life when I got a call from my agent saying, can you come down to London for a job interview, script editing? The job is script editing Doctor Who, and the man you're going to talk to is John Nathan Turner, which is, you know, everybody who's gone out for tea or to have a kebab while I was talking up to this point, they can now join the interview.
So, John Nathan Turner, we will come on to. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of eerie, Paul, because his room, the room I went to, the office where he interviewed me, it was painted pillar box red. Now, who would live in a place like that? Yeah. So there's a kind of little eerie echo. Yeah. And so there was this strange kind of womb-like room, bright red walls, like pillar box red walls, and all this Doctor Who paraphernalia scattered around it. And I went in, and and the first thing is I met Kate Easthill, who was the secretary there, who's one of these unsung heroes of Doctor Who, who's just about to begin to appear on people's radar. Because when we did the season, I'm going to count the numbers, season 26 box ray set, yeah,
Blu-ray,
Blu-ray
yeah,
set.
yeah.
The box set Blu-ray set of season 26 has all these great extras, and they actually managed to get hold of Kate and bring her in to talk to her, I think, about John for the John Nathan Turner documentary. Because she was, listen, the Doctor Who team was as follows. It was John, Kate, and me. That was it. I mean, like, people will think, oh, that can't be right. No, that was it. That was the Doctor Who team. You'd then have production crews who would join for an individual story. So you'd have like the production associate, which was like the production accountant. You'd have the director, the assistant director. It wasn't called the assistant director, it was called something else. That whole team would join, do a story, then go. And then the next one would come, and we'd do 4 stories, 3 production teams for reasons we can talk about if you like, but did 4 stories, 3 teams, 4 stories. We'd finish the season, they'd go away, and it'd be me, John, and Kate. And so she was really an important member of the team. So one day I went in to Union House in Shepherd's Bush Green, waited with trepidation on a sofa. Kate, this stunning redhead, really vivacious and smart, came down, collected me. We went upstairs to John's bright red office, and he sort of chatted, and he said, the first thing he said, he sort of looked at me, he said, oh, where's your accent? Because he's always very good with people and things like that. So he said, where are you from? So he detected I had a bit of an accent, so we talked about me being Canadian, British Canadian, and talked about my script, which he had read, the phone sex script, which my agent Richard had given him. I should mention here that Richard and John were mates. That's the way everything happens.
Yeah.
They'd been actors together, I believe, on I can't remember the name, an early hospital drama, Emergency Ward 10. Yes, I think they'd both worked on it. I don't know if they both worked as actors, but Richard had been an actor, as he very charmingly said, a really bad actor, terrible actor at that point, and he'd met John, and they've remained buddies ever since. So that's the way these things happen. So he'd given John my script. John had read it, and he had sort of an interesting note about how the psycho killer, who was just a psycho killer, he said maybe he needs some kind of motivation, some hint of an explanation about why he is the way he is. And at the time I thought, nonsense. But the more I thought about it over the years, the more I think how right he was. And he said, you could just have a scene where he goes to a graveyard and looks at his wife's grave or something. I sort of pretended that I thought this was a great idea. But over the years, I think that is a really good idea. So he was a very perceptive, very interesting man. And the interview went well. And he sort of said, okay, well, if we hire you, this is what's going to happen. And it was pretty clear at that point that things had gone well, which was, to me, a tremendously worrying thing, because although I wasn't enjoying my job in Cambridge, I was safe in a little niche. And I now had to give up my flat, my job, my career, everything, and just go to London and start this entirely new thing. So it may sound, people out there might be thinking, how could he? But I actually thought, should I do this thing? Mm. And like my agent said, are you fucking crazy? Just take the job. So I took the job.
Yeah. With John, I mean, John's someone who's been reappraised in recent years. But I always wondered when it came to that time of you first meeting him, how he approached you, because it's well known, of course, he'd had a bit of a falling out with Eric Saywood beforehand. Was he in any way suspicious of you, or did he accept you straight away, or did he have to get the measure of you?
No, he was not suspicious at all of me. He was just very charming. Had always had a good nose for talent. I mean, that he would hire people like Dominic Glynn and Mark Ayres, the people who did the music for the show, who had no track record. He wasn't bothered if you didn't have a track record. He just thought if he sensed that you might be able to do the job, he'd give you a shot, which, trust me, Paul, is almost unique. I mean, it's such a rare thing for somebody to do that. I did only realize later how lucky I was. But you're saying, was he distrustful of me? Not then, but once I joined the show, a certain measure of paranoia began to kick in on several fronts. Once I started working, because the honeymoon period was over, I was actually doing my job, and the sort of things that would bother him would be if I was talking to the fan press. That would really worry him. But that we'll talk about that in a minute. That ended very quickly anyway. What sort of things? When we actually got into production, then the pressure kicked in, and then I could see another side of John. Like, he could be quite bad tempered, because I later realized he was under huge pressure from the job. He was under huge pressure domestically because his father was falling apart. John was now the man in the family because his father had been this, from what I understand, this really tough, kind of very macho man, had a bunch of strokes and had crumbled. And so John had to look after his father and his mother and everything, and then race back to Brighton and race to London. Anyway, he had a lot of pressure, and also he was a drinker. And one thing I have observed about people who drink alcohol, a lot of alcohol, is it does not improve their temper. I mean, I'm talking about when they're sober. When they're sober, they're generally hungover or not feeling great. And so all of those factors are sort of reasons to forgive John being bad-tempered and being a bit difficult to work with. Although they don't entirely forgive him, but they just explain that. I'm just trying to think of some classic examples of things that John didn't like. Occasionally this is a classic. When we were shooting Paradise Towers, Stephen Wyatt and I were watching what they were doing, and there was the extras who were like the in Paradise Towers you have the concierges. That wasn't what they were called. There's another word for them, but they're the sort of the uniformed officials who look after
caretakers.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and a bunch of these. Some of these were important actors like Richard Briers, but some of them were non-speaking extras, and they were in the uniforms. And Stephen got really concerned. I believe his worry was that they looked too neat, tidy, and sort of big and organized. They were supposed to look terrible. So he really wanted that to happen, and he wanted me to give the note to John, and nothing seemed to be happening. So he begged me to go to John and give him the note again, because he was really worried about this. And that was one of the times that John snapped at me. He said, "Yeah, you've said this before. I'm on it. Just leave me alone." Blah, 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 like a dog barking at you and snapping at you. And he did sort that out. But that was a classic, because we were up in what they call the gallery, which is the control room, watching all this happen. And so that was a classic. That's a classic kind of double bind thing, because I didn't want to get in my producer's way, but I wanted to make sure the writer was happy. So this is an example of the script editor being stuck in the middle. But that's a classic case of when John would snap. By snap, I mean just snap at you, not crack up. He was made of sterner stuff than that. And also, we were getting along quite famously just when it was all starting. And then I heard these rumors about Eric, about what had happened. And also, it was pretty clear something had happened, because when I came into my office, I couldn't open the desk drawer. And the reason I couldn't open it is because the key had been snapped off in it. And so I've told this story before, but it's worth hearing again. Yeah. So I got the BBC carpenter. There was a little man who went around called Mr. Mystery, who was the carpenter. And I got him to open the desk drawer. And when he opened it, what was inside it was some shreds of script and a wine glass with some dried red wine in it, sort of rolling around. So I've always thought that this was Eric's last act as a script editor, was to Natalie snap back glass of his glass around, chuck it in the drawer, shut the drawer, lock the door, snap the key off, and it's like, take your job and shove it. So, and there's probably a pretty accurate account of Eric's last moments in that office. So, but not solely through that, but through the grapevine, I'd learned that my predecessor had left in a stormy way. So I asked John about it. He immediately got cagey, and he said, "Oh, why do you want to know?" And I said, "I just heard this rumor, like, what happened?" And I'm not sure if it was then or later, but John sort of said a number of things about it. He said, we used to hang out together all the time. Maybe we were sort of too close. And the other thing he said, that when Robert Holmes had died, that had really hit Eric Sayward hard, which I could understand, because Robert Holmes was a great Doctor Who writer. I think he may still be the greatest Doctor Who writer. And Eric, because Eric's a very smart and tasteful man, had revered Robert Holmes. And indeed, he had built his own writing style for Doctor Who, Eric's own writing style, in emulation of Robert Holmes, which is a good thing to do, because there's nobody better to follow in the footsteps of. So I could really imagine that when Robert Holmes died, that it had hit Eric hard. And the impression I got was that he'd felt that this may be completely wrong, but this is what I got from what John had sort of given me, was that Eric might have felt that he'd sort of worked Robert Holmes to death, and he blamed John for it. This is just my rough impression of things, my interpretation of things.
Yeah. looking at, and I could be completely wrong here as well, but when I was trying to work out when you joined up at the BBC onto Doctor Who, it looked like you maybe only had about 10 to 12 weeks
Oh, we had
joining and
around and
starting
running.
production.
Oh yeah, thank God I didn't know what I was in for. I didn't know what a task. I mean, but it was all normal to me. So I thought, oh, this is just what we do. That's fine. But also crucially, I didn't come in with a blank slate because I'd come from that script unit I mentioned, where I'd met people like Malcolm Cole and Ian Briggs, whom I immediately commissioned because I knew they were good and I knew them and
But
deserved a break. Yeah.
yeah, but so you had one script ready, didn't you? Which is the
Yes,
Time and the
in
Money.
no, in theory, you're smiling and I'm smiling. In theory, we had one script ready, but it was unworkable. What
Right.
John had done is he was always a wily old pro, John. So he knew. You see, what had happened is John had been in conflict with whoever was running the BBC at the time, which was Michael Grade. But
Mm.
it would change, and he'd remain in conflict because Doctor people will find this hard to believe, but Doctor Who was despised, and I mean, like completely despised by. I'm not exaggerating, by the powers that be. Uh, and they wanted to kill the show off, but it was like there's a Monty Python skit about burying the cat, and it takes 3 hours because the cat won't stop struggling. So, as a cat lover, I think it's a horrible joke, but it is quite funny. But the point I'm making is they were trying to bury Doctor Who, but Doctor Who kept struggling. So it wasn't easy to kill the show, but they
Mm.
wanted to. And but you see, in fairness to them, John had kind of done a really bad job in some ways with Who. He'd been at it for a long time and he'd done a lot of interesting stuff, but he'd also done some really dodgy, bad stuff. And he'd got it up people's noses. And the show wasn't really that great. And it was not great in some worrying ways, in that it had become quite, some episodes were quite harsh and nasty,
Mm.
nasty in the sense of video nasty. And we can talk about Vengeance on Veros in detail if we want, but it was that kind of thing, which is incidentally, I think, a fantastic script. I think Philip's script for that is wonderful. I just don't think it's Doctor Who. And it's much too dark, much too nasty, much too violent. So there were reasons to object to the stuff that John was doing.
Mm.
Uh, so Doctor Who was out of favor, but John was clinging on, and they'd basically put the show on hiatus. They'd done it once before, and they'd done it again, I believe. And that was where I came in, is that the show had been on hiatus while they tried to kill it, and they couldn't kill it. So suddenly they made a decision to bring it back. John, like I say, was a wily old pro, so he was aware that if the show was going to go, it would go suddenly. So he had commissioned a script from Pip and Jane Baker, a pair of highly professional TV writers who had got John out of a jam before, and he liked them a lot, and they did a very workmanlike job. They could work quickly, and he was grateful to them. So he'd commissioned this script in his back pocket, on the shelf script, that was there from them for that reason. And it seemed like I'm sure it was the right thing to do at the time. It was a smart thing for him to do. But the problem was the script in and of itself really didn't work. It was changed considerably. But also, Pip and Jane were not the kind of writers I wanted in the show. I wanted fresh voices, and they were anything but. Which wouldn't have been a problem if we could have worked together, but we couldn't work together because they, just to give them their due, I never really gave them their due. At the time, I just thought they were an incredible pain in the neck, which they were. But I've subsequently learned that they'd had a long track record and done some very interesting stuff, not on Doctor Who particularly. What they did do was create the Rani, who's a great character, great villain. No, I've got no complaints about that, but I didn't like their scripts for Who at all. But they'd been writing loads of other scripts over the decades, and some of them quite highly regarded, like quite hard-hitting social dramas. So, they deserved some measure of respect, but then so did I. And the problem was Jane in particular, just would not listen to anything I said. She just thought I was just some empty-headed little idiot that John had hired, and this was not a good recipe for success in terms of us working together. We just couldn't work together. If they'd been willing to work with me, or if John had been willing to just let me completely rewrite the scripts, Time in the Rani could have been a much better story. But having said all that, there are some people who love Time in the Rani, and more power to them. There's a lot of things to love about it. The designer, I believe, was Jeff Powell, who had just won, I think he just won a BAFTA for his work on a play about Kafka, which I want to say it's The History Man, but that's a Malcolm Bradbury. the book, isn't it? Anyway, so Jeff Powell was an incredibly talented designer. If you look at like the Ronnie's lair, it's fabulous. The design is stupendous. The acting is really good. The costumes are nice. Andrew Morgan is a very good director, but I think it's all for naught because I don't think the script's up to much. So that's my feeling about it. Time and the Ronnie. So yes, we had the first episode of Time and the Ronnie, which at that point was called Strange Matter. But that first episode, as I say, probably changed beyond all recognition anyway. So we kind of didn't have anything.
And when you came to the show, had Sylvester been cast at that point?
Oh, he wasn't even a twinkle in John's eye at that point. So all John had was an actor, Colin Baker, who was very pissed off about having been canned. As I understand it, Michael Grade had insisted that he be sacked from the role. Now, I like Colin a great deal, and I think Colin's a very good actor. But I think, and I've said this, we've discussed this between ourselves, me and Colin, the interpretation of Doctor Who that he'd been given of the character was not good, was not workable. And I've talked to Eric about this too, because it's fairly interesting because you had all these talented people working together, and what came out was not good. And what was not good was, as I understand, after his regeneration, I'm trying to remember which doctor, this would have been the sixth Doctor, right, Colin?
Yeah.
He emerged from his regeneration kind of in a psychotic state. And so he was like this aggressive, nasty, not nice character. And that's a valid story point. You get some episodes out of that, right? And it's full of drama. But the trouble is, if you don't like the Doctor, you're in fucking bad trouble with the show. And he wasn't a likable character. And once having started with him there, Eric felt that you couldn't instantly just change him into a likable character. You sort of had to work your way around to it. So they'd started on the wrong foot. And then the costume is utterly reprehensible. I mean, it's just, I've seen the sort of fan costume that has developed for Colin, which is all blue, and it's much better. But, you've got this unlikable character in this hideous costume, and you've got some scripts which really aren't Doctor Who and perhaps are questionable in other ways. And you've got a formula for disaster, I think. And that, anyway, so Grade had decided to blame it all on Colin because he was the front man. And Colin's character, Colin's character, Inventions of Varus, to go back to that again, which I say is a fabulous science fiction thriller for adults. As a Doctor Who episode, I've argued the point with Philip Martin, the guy who's and I'm not just saying this by rote. He's a fabulous writer. He wrote this series called Gangsters, which I just loved. Wasn't it
wonderful? Gangsters. Maurice Coburn stars in that, doesn't he? And brilliant.
And I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. So, I'm not just saying he was a great writer and secretly thinking he was a hack. He was a great writer. Yeah. But, and I've discussed this because I did a con with Philip. It wasn't Doctor Who. And he disagrees with that. But so we have to agree to disagree. But for example, there's a scene in that where the Doctor is struggling with some bad guys, and a bad guy, and the jeopardy is that they're struggling over an acid bath, a pool of acid, and the Doctor gets the better, or the bad guy slips. The bad guy falls in the acid bath, and the Doctor says, "Oh, don't mind if I don't join you," or words to that effect. Now, if you're James Bond, that's great. If you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, that's great. But if you're the Doctor, it's not great. To me, the Doctor should have made a desperate bid to save the guy from this horrible fate. And then, which is a much more white knight, white bread, straight down the middle interpretation, than this. And I'm sure when they shot that, John and everybody was laughing deliciously at this dark gag, but it's not the Doctor. And it's so not the Doctor that you get Michael Grade sacking Colin Baker. I'm not saying that show was the trigger for it, but when I went back and tried to work out why Michael Grade was so pissed off, that seemed to me a pretty good potential explanation for it. So you're going to have to remind me what the jumping off point of this was, or maybe it doesn't even matter. We were just talking.
Sylvester's casting.
Thank you. So I was saying that Colin was gone, and not only was he gone, he was so pissed off with the way he'd gone that he wouldn't even come back for the regeneration scene. So we didn't only not have a new Doctor, we didn't even have an old Doctor. So we were really. But what John did is he then began to look around for talent, which, as I said, he was fantastic at. And we looked at a bunch of people, including Ken Campbell. Now, people who know about Sylvester will know that he came from the Ken Campbell repertory company, the Ken Campbell Road Show. He'd been working with Ken for years, I believe, and that's where he got his name, because that's not his real name. His real name is Kent. Sylvester McCoy, the human bomb, was a character created for this. Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? For the Ken Campbell Roadshow. But anyway, the reason I mention this is we got Ken Campbell himself in to audition for the part. And that was really interesting. He was really nervous, which I can understand, and he really went for it. Just he read something in John's office, and the thing was, he was like a bull in a china shop. He was too powerful and too strange. Like a doctor's got to be strange. And I think, to go back to poor old Colin, it sounds like I'm just putting the boot into Colin. But the trouble um, with Peter and Colin, I'm sorry, I've blanked on Dr. Peter Davidson, right? Problem with both those guys was that they were handsome leading men who were quite straight characters, quite normal characters. And as you might imagine, I've had a lot of time over the years to ponder these matters. So I think what happened was, like, John Nathan Turner came in at the end of the Tom Baker era. Now, Tom Baker is a strange alien kind of doctor, like those big bug eyes, and like he can just effortlessly convey the impression that he's not human. So, and a terrific actor too. But the thing was, and he was he loved weird stories. So when him and Douglas Adams were doing it, it was a perfect combination. But John came in on the end of that, and he got fed up with Tom Baker's lunacy and Tom Baker's eccentricity and the weirdness of that. So when he had a chance to recast the Doctor, I could see why he'd go for a much straighter, much more normal Doctor. And Peter Davison, very handsome guy, very terrific actor, but a very normal Doctor. You don't want a normal Doctor. And Colin Baker, again, handsome leading man type, normal. I mean, he was nasty, but he was never seemed alien to me. So those were the failings with Doctors 5 and 6, I think, is that they weren't doctorish enough. And the funny thing is, doctorish is a term I got from John Nathan Turner, so he understood that. But I think he became seduced by wanting handsome leading men who are heroic, right? But you need that other dimension to the Doctor. You need somebody who's weird. And Ken Campbell was too explosively weird. He was just too much. I mean, he was really powerful, really interesting. But so he was too much. But then Sylvester came in, and it was like Goldilocks and Three Bears, because he was just right. He was just weird enough, right? And he was fabulous. I remember when he came into the office, John's office again, the Red Room, and he had I think it was a Tweety Pie. He had a tin briefcase with a cartoon on. I think it was Tweety Pie, or it might have been Bugs Bunny, right? So instantly, I kind of love that about it. And he brought like a little hat in, which was paved the way for the hat that eventually he had a straw hat, sort of as a nod towards doing a costume thing. And so he came in and he did a bunch of stuff, and he was just wonderful. He was like an animated cartoon in 3 dimensions and human flesh. And we loved it. John and I both fell in love with him right away and thought, this is the guy we want. But we then had to get it past the powers that be. So what John did then was he took another actor who was in the running, who again was a very straight, normal kind of guy. Very good actor, but really not, you wouldn't think he was from outer space. Whereas with Sylvester, this was never in question. So John took Sylvester and the other actor, and he did a screen test and shot both of them with the same scripts, which I wrote. I wrote a couple of short scripts. One was sort of a hard-hitting scene where the Doctor stood up to a baddie, and the other one was an elegiac scene where he shows sadness and introspection. And just to be really self-serving, both of those audition scripts are available in my book, Script Doctor. I'm not being terribly self-serving because it's out of print at the moment, but you can get a copy in a library somewhere, or your friend might have a copy, borrow it. And you can check, you can read those audition scripts, and they went really well. And what John did is he got Janet Fielding to be the other person in there. So the 2 scenes were, one was he's facing down a baddie and telling her off. And the baddie was like this kind of iron woman, dictatorial type, because of course this is their Margaret Thatcher, so that was a trope that was in my head. So Janet played the baddie, and then Janet played the companion in the other scene with the Doctor saying goodbye to the companion. So that's a really kind of completely different emotional tone. It's not hostile, it's not in conflict. It's sorrowful because he's saying goodbye. And I did sort of too good a job of that, because Sylvester loved that scene so much. He kept trying to get it into one of the stories, and he did eventually. He got it in Dragonfire when Bonnie says goodbye. That was taken from the audition script I wrote, and it was sort of gene spliced into poor Ian Briggs' his DNA on that script. But Ian's aware of that and what happened and why it happened. Because what actually happened is Sylvester said, "Let's put this in Dragonfire," and Ian said, "No, no, I'll write a version of that." And it was like, "Let's use the original." Sylvester's like, "Oh, we prefer the original." It's a bit like when somebody does, when you make a movie, you put music on it, and you hire somebody to write the music, and people fall in love with the music they put on it. So, for instance, Stanley Kubrick fell in love with uh, "Thus Spake Zarathustra" by Richard Strauss, and he put it in 2001. And Alex North was the guy who was hired to do the music, great composer. And he said, "Okay, I'll do my version of this." And I see what you're getting at. I'll do my version. And Stanley Kubrick heard it and thought, "No, I'll just keep the original." So it was the same kind of principle with this little tiny audition piece. But it's a really lovely scene. I could see why Sylvester wanted to use it. And so that ended up. But anyway, we're talking about Sylvester coming on the show. Well, that's actually quite nice, because it carries Sylvester right into when he started acting. So we had these two auditions, and the other guy was really good, but Sylvester was obviously the star. And so we got Sylvester. And that was great, because suddenly we were in business. Because although I wasn't happy with Pip and Jane's scripts, I had all these other writers lined up whose work I would be happy with, because I knew I liked their stuff to start with, and I could work with them. I mentioned Ian Briggs and Malcolm Cole, who had been with me at the script unit, the BBC Encourage Young Writers initiative, and also Stephen Wyatt, who had been there too, but I'd never met him there. We were sort of ships that passed in the night. But what he did was he sent me in a script to read, which was perfect. It wasn't Doctor Who, but I could immediately see that he could write a Doctor Who, and that script was called Claws, and it was about cat breeders who are also witches. Well, they would later become witches, but it was just about nasty backstabbing in the dark underworld of cat breeding. I thought, what's not to love about this? This guy's great. He's got a dark sense of humor. Let's get him in. And he was terrific from the off.
And over the course of that first season, of course, Sylvester McCoy does start as a very comedic Doctor.
Yeah.
Presumably, then that would have been a deliberate way of winning over people on the sixth floor, maybe.
No,
no.
What it was is just that Sylvester was uncomfortable in the role. He didn't know who he was. Nobody knew who he was.
Right, yeah.
Because nobody had written scripts for him before. So you had a generic Doctor in the Pip and Jane script, so it wasn't tailored to him, and it didn't play to his strengths. So Sylvester wanted to put his mark on it, put his stamp on it. So one of the things that Sylvester is, one of the many things he is a brilliant physical comedian. So to get him in his comfort zone and to begin to make the role his own, that's what he did. Because there was no question of changing any of Pip and Jane's dialogue, because they just wouldn't change anything. And it wasn't that, that would be okay if it was great, but it wasn't that great. So he was stuck with the plot and the dialogue that he'd been given, but this was something he could do to add to it. And they weren't particularly pleased about it. And it wasn't that great, because it was just sort of throwing one thing on top of another thing, neither of them working together, no real coherence. But that's okay. This was like our starter story, right? It was a starter script. And from that point on, we could begin to write for Sylvester and begin to write stories that would work well with him.
Can we talk about the character development of the Doctor? No?
Yeah, of course.
The character who we get at the start of season 24 is so different to the character who we end up with in season 26. Was that your decision in charge of script, or Sylvester's, or was it a combination of actor and script editor working together?
So Time of the Rani that didn't work. Let's write that off.
Right.
Cruel but true. While that was happening, I was hiring Stephen Wyatt, Ian Briggs, and Malcolm Cole. Mm-hmm. And we were lucky, because at that point we knew who the Doctor was going to be. So they weren't just writing into the void, which in fairness, Pip and Jane, to be fair to them, they didn't know. Sylvester hadn't been cast yet, so they didn't know how to write to its strengths. But these other writers who were coming downstream knew that they had Sylvester, and we went to see Sylvester who was at the National Theatre in the Pied Piper of Hamlet, and he was in that. So they could see him on stage, they could meet him. We engineered a meeting, I believe, and they could begin to get the measure of him. Also, as time went on, went into production, we could begin to see him on screen. So people began to write with Sylvester in mind. We still were just kind of finding our way forward. And you mentioned how different the Doctor was. Well, I began to realize, I can't say exactly when it was, but certainly it was sometime in that first year, that the crucial problem with the Doctor, as he had been portrayed and betrayed, he'd been betrayed. The crucial problem with his portrayal for quite a long time, I mentioned the fact that he wasn't doctorish enough, but more than that, the best way of perhaps pointing this out is The Caves of Androzani, right? Which is a Robert Holmes script. Robert Holmes is genius. Wonderful, wonderful writer. And in fact, John Nathan Turner, when he first hired me, he gave me that one to watch because he was very proud of it. And he's not wrong. There's a lot of great things about Caves of Androzani. He said he was particularly proud of the monster. I saw the monster. I thought, well, it's just a Chinese New Year dragon. It's terrible. But I didn't tell him that. But that's not the problem with that story. The problem is if you look at that story, it's full of fascinating stuff. But the Doctor is he's incidental. He's not at the center of things. He's not moving things. He's not in charge of things. He doesn't have, in the fashionable word of our day, agency. He's just like a cork bobbing on a stream. He's just being thrown hither and yon by events. And that was, you see, so you could have a really good story in other respects, good production values, great cast, great script, but the Doctor's nowhere. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible Doctor Who story because the Doctor is marginalized. So at some point I began to write, okay, that's the problem. There's the problems are Doctor's got to be doctorish, right? He's got to be at the center of his story. I mean, that's just basic TV writing. You write to your leads. So that was kind of unforgivable. But the thing is, Doctor's a science fiction show, and it's not like the Doctor's got a clear through line the way that a cop does in a cop show or a detective does in a detective show. Although I would argue the Doctor is kind of a detective, right? You know, investigating things, solving cases. But he's a difficult character to get hold of. So you have this. So he needs to be at the center of the story. And the other thing was, he wasn't just marginalized, he was a bit of a chump. He was a bit of a fall guy, because that was one of the many things wrong with Trial of a Time Lord, is that he's just stuck there in the dock. Like, my Doctor would have been in the dock for about 30 seconds before he reversed it. So he was accusing them of something, and he would be the one who was, laying down the law. You know, that just couldn't happen to the Doctor in my mind. He's just too powerful, and all the mystery had gone out of the Doctor. And I was able over the years to do quite a bit of research on how that came about. And it begins quite early on with the meddling monk, I would say, because what happens is you've got the title of the show is Doctor Who. We don't know who he is, where he's from, anything. We don't know nothing. But very early on, there's a story called The Meddling Monk, in which it turns out that there's another one kind of like the Doctor, because he's also kind of got a TARDIS. So suddenly the Doctor's not unique. Uh-oh, that's not good. And there wasn't much explanation of this, but the explanation that eventually came along was that they were both from Gallifrey. They were both something called Time Lords. There's a planet where there's a whole bunch of Time Lords. By the time we hit War Games, which is a great story, a little too long, but fabulous. One of the great classics of the show. You've got the Doctor. It's a bit of a Trial of the Time Lord thing again, isn't it? I mean, the Time Lords are laying. You see, the Doctor isn't just. First of all, he's unique. Then he's not unique. He's not only are there other Time Lords, he's not even like the boss Time Lord, right? He's just a lowly Time Lord. And so he basically gets grounded. He gets grounded to Earth at the beginning of the next series, at the beginning of the Pertwee years, right? Now, again, this is all done for every single one of these decisions was made for good story reasons. Good in the sense that they gave you more story opportunities. And particularly the grounding to Earth thing made a huge amount of sense, because for budgetary reasons, they didn't want to go to a load of other planets. Now, this, from my point of view, is great, because I think Doctor Who works best when you've got the alien Doctor in a mundane situation. So I think I always loved Earth-based stuff, historical-based stuff. You could bring in aliens, but you don't want a whole alien thing, because as soon as you're on another planet, it's just, well, A, it's hard to do. But
Mm.
B, if you've got the Doctor who's like this crazy alien guy and he lands on another alien planet, you've lost that conflict, right? Because you just got a whole bunch of alien stuff. It's like too much spice in the bouillabaisse. What you want is contrast, normality with strangeness. So anyway, getting back to what was wrong with the Doctor is that, so, he became, each one of those decisions lessened the Doctor's stature. And by the time, which the nadir was reached in Trial of Time, so okay, let's go back to square one, where the Doctor is this mysterious entity. We can keep every bit of lore, every canonical decision. We can preserve all that, but say, aha, all that's true, but something else is true as well. The Doctor is actually far more than that. He's mysterious, he's godlike, he's prior to all this Gallifrey stuff. And people still ask me, well, what was he? The whole point was, I didn't come up with a, if I'd come up with another answer, we'd have been back to square one. The
Yeah.
point was not to answer the question. The point was to reestablish the question. So that was what I began to realize that's exactly what we needed. More powerful, more mysterious, master of his own destiny and everybody else's. And all that Gallifrey stuff, we can keep it, but there's something, as our American friends would say, in back of it, behind it. And now, luckily for me, I had the services of a lot of great writers, including Mark Platt and Ben Aronovich. Now, the reason I enlisted their help at this point was because Mark knew all about the show. He loved the show. He knew everything there was to know about the show. And Ben wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool fan, but he'd done his classic thing is he does an enormous amount of research. So he'd watched every goddamn tape that they had in John's office. So he knew a lot too. Plus, he would have done his research in terms of other resources about the history of the show, about the history of the characterization of the show. So these guys knew a lot about Gallifrey. So I said, okay, boys, this is what we need to achieve. Why don't you, within the terms of the Gallifrey thing, work out how we do that? So all that stuff about Rassilon and Omega, this all derived from those wonderful writers unleashed to solve this problem, which is a really good problem to solve because it just made for a more interesting show and a more interesting hero. Now, how did Sylvester come into this? As soon as Sylvester became aware that we were cooking up a scheme to make his character better, he was very pleased and he was very down with it because he wanted to be able to play it hard as well as soft, right? And as part of all this, we need to mention Bonnie Langford. Now, Bonnie, who's terrific and has gone on to do some great stuff, like the stuff that she's reading for Big Finish, is wonderful.
Yeah.
But she, like Colin Baker, had been saddled with a zero of a character. Because if you look back in the dawn of time, Mel, the character she played, Mel was supposed to be a computer scientist. She was supposed to be all these interesting things, but all I just went by, and she, because Bonnie was famous for, I'll scream and scream, scream, she just became a screamer. Too many companions have been screamers and runners. And we wanted, so what I'm getting around to is the fact that when Bonnie left the show, there was a real opportunity to build the Doctor up because you suddenly, as long as Bonnie's there in her silly costume with her camp role, it's sort of, the whole thing's a bit camp, right? And a bit silly and a bit screamy. But as soon as she's gone, it's like a blank slate. It's a fresh start. So as soon as Ace came on board, Sophie Aldred in the role of Ace, it enhanced our ability to big up the Doctor and to start afresh. And of course, Ace was great in her own right, in no small part due to Ian Briggs writing the first script about her and fleshing out that character, which he did to perfection.
I mean, the character of Ace was originally you came up with the basic idea, didn't you? But she was called Alf.
Yeah. So here's the thing. If you hire a freelance writer, or in those days, to create a character, a companion for the show, then that freelance writer gets paid every time that character appears, even if they're not writing those shows. And the BBC, tight purse strings, they could get around that if somebody who had signed a silly contract like I had, where they owned everything inside my head, if I created the character, then the BBC owned the character. So John got me to create the character, and I did. And it's basically Ace, but it's like a very crude sketch of Ace. And for a start, she was called, as you said, Alf.
Mhm.
And Ian took this, and she was a teenage demolition teenage demolition expert, threw explosives around, wore Doc Martens. So that was all kind of there. But Ian took this very, very rough pencil sketch, just turned it into a Rembrandt. He called her Ace. He gave a reason for that, because that's her favorite expression, and he just brought her to life. I mean, Ian just did a wonderful job. And then suddenly we had a character that writers could fall in love with and build on.
Mm. It's an interesting thing. Something that you said before about Malcolm Hulke, he's well known for being a political writer, and I think if you watch his Who's, I think you can certainly see that. But of course, your time on the show became quite well known for some of its political stances as well. Um, was that was that a deliberate decision that the show should go more political? And I am thinking partly of the Happiness Patrol here, which
Yeah.
is quite a statement.
Well, here's the thing. There used to be an ad campaign in America for Levi's bagels.
Mm.
And the ad campaign was, you don't have to be Jewish to love Levi's. And you'd have an Eskimo eating a bagel, somebody from the Kalahari eating a bagel. You don't have to be Jewish. So the reason I mention that is, you didn't have to be political to hate Thatcher. I was living in a country run by a woman called Margaret Thatcher, and you didn't have to be on the left or on the right or in the middle or even political just to see terrible, reprehensible things that were being done. And so I was very up in arms about that. The reason I make that point is I'm not a leftist. I basically hate politics in all its forms. But at that point, there was something particularly insidious to hate. So I was reacting against that. So to that extent, the show became politicized, because that was the water that we were all swimming in at the time. And it was conscious, but we felt strongly about this, and I still maintain that it's not a question of politics; it's a question of human decency.
I was chatting to Sophie Aldred the other day, and I asked her some questions, which I suppose are more on the production side, and she said that John was very good at shielding herself and Sylvester from some of the more unusual BBC decisions, and I was wondering if John ever shielded you, and particularly with one point, which is, I think that if you watch season 25 and season 26, you get this show that is obviously it's going through somewhat of a renaissance. And I always think that if you look at season 26, it's very good Doctor Who, but then again, you've got The Curse of Fenric, which is just bloody good telly. Take Doctor Who out of it, it's just good telly. What was it like then for you to be making this show? And you must have known that you were really hitting your stride here. And yet every single year on the 6th floor, they put it opposite Coronation Street.
Oh, yeah.
What was that like? I mean, could anything have been done, or was that just the decision and that was it?
Well, I told you that they hated the show, and they decided they hated the show, and they decided the show was bad. So they didn't look at what we did. They weren't aware that we were improving it. They just didn't look at it. They had fixed in their brain what it was, and it was something reprehensible and to be got rid of. And it's not too much to ask that they could have looked at it and realized that we were doing great stuff. Or even if you didn't think it was great stuff, you could see it was great compared to what had gone before, right? But nobody was interested in giving us that chance or giving us a fair shake. So I was aware. The thing about going up against Coronation Street, I never knew any different, right? So I wasn't really aware of how terrible that was, and we did surprisingly well, considering that was a suicide slot, right? But so was I shielded? Well, I wasn't really shielded, because I was aware that people held Doctor Who in contempt. They just did. I mean, I've mentioned this before, but there was the BBC laid on this evening, a sort of cheese and wine evening, where script editors were invited to meet a whole bunch of hot young writers who wanted to get in. And these writers are all dying for a job, right? They're dying to impress the script editor and make friends with the script editor. So I'd be introduced to these various writers, and as soon as they heard that I was at Doctor Who, they would just like zoom, they'll be gone. You know, it's, oh, excuse me. So like you could just see all the interest and happiness drain out of their face when they realized which show I was scripting, except for Rona Monroe, who squealed with delight. And I thought, okay, we'll give her a gig.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
But that's just to illustrate. You said about was I aware of the pressures? I was
Yeah.
aware of that we were held in contempt, but more importantly, I was aware of how terribly low the budget was, especially for a science fiction show, a show as ambitious as ours. Because whenever we were shooting, it was just there was no time, no money. But listen, I have to quote. There's a classic story which I believe is called the Aztecs. Is there a story called the Aztecs?
Yes, William Hartnell. Yeah.
Right. So I have always like I'm still angry about what the terrible budget we were laboring under. You know, it was just. But the reason I mentioned the Aztecs is I watched the Aztecs, and there's it's shot in the studio. It's supposed to be outdoors in ancient Mexico or somewhere, and they've got this painted backdrop, right, which is supposed to be like the hills and the sky and stuff in the distance. And you can actually see that it's like a curtain. You can actually see the wrinkles in the backdrop, right? And I just thought, these people, they were idiots. But then I learned what happened was the show was supposed to be shot in a certain studio, and the backdrop was for that studio. Then it got moved to a smaller studio, so it was the wrong size, and they couldn't resize it. So I thought, oh, my heart goes out to you, because that was what it was like for me every day. And so obviously things hadn't changed much. We'd always been underfunded, but chronically underfunded by the time I came along. So you were aware that there were problems with the show, yeah.
So was part of John's skill, and I think this will go back to a point you mentioned before, was part of John's skill being able to take that money and expand it? Because presumably before, when you said four stories with three units attached,
yeah,
was that to do with that?
Very astute of you, Paul. That's exactly what it's about. Because what John had, he had the money for. Let me get this straight in my head. Yeah, he had his money for an all-location story, an all-studio story, and one that was, I'm just getting this right, one that basically he was supposed to do a 6-part story, which was a mixture of OB, outside broadcast, location shooting, and studio. But what John realized was that he could take that story, and if he did half of it all in studio and half of it all in location, instead of a 6-parter, with a mix of those two things, you ended up with 2 3-parters, one studio based, one location based. So that was very smart. Yeah, so the other stories were mixtures. They were 4-parters, weren't they? They were mixtures. Yep. They were mixtures of the two. So that way we got 4 stories instead of 3, and it was especially good because, as John recognized, 6-parters are not good. 6 parts too long. 3 parts is a natural format. 4 parts natural format. 6 episodes too much, baby.
And presumably you became accustomed to working with that, because in that final season we get Ghostlight all in studio, beautifully claustrophobic, and then Survival, which is all location. You've got that expanse. So would that have been something that you would have worked with the writers on, making sure that it was all studio or all location?
To get the hang of it by that point, yeah. I mean, it really hammers it home to you when I'm on location for Delta and the Bannermen, and it's all being shot on Barry Island and everywhere. Then you're locked up in the studio for Dragonfire. You get the point. You understand what the beast is like. So the next year, it was the 3-parter was Silver Nemesis on location, and the Happiness Patrol, wasn't it? The 3-parter in the studio. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, because I'm obsessive. So we also.
That year, you also had Remembrance of the Daleks and The Greatest Show in the Galaxy.
Thank you. That was the other one I was looking for. 2 4-parters, which are mixed.
Just checking the DVD shelf. But yes, yeah.
That's right. So, okay, yeah. So by the time we hit the final season, yeah, when you mentioned about Ghostlight, it wasn't just claustrophobic because it was Victorian. You built this beautiful house. I mean, you were on this set. I mentioned this to somebody the other day, how great the set was. They said, "Oh, I didn't realize it was a set," because it was just built, and every room was like a room, and every staircase was like a staircase, and it was like a real environment. That was, again, it speaks to my thing about how I loved to take Doctor Who and plug alien doings into a familiar real world setting. And that worked tremendously well with the BBC, because if you give them a period, they evoke the period beautifully, the costumes and the sets and everything. And then so you get this wonderful Victorian world, and then you have all this crazy Mark Platt alien stuff happening in it. And also the Doctor is crazy and alien too. So him arriving is wonderful. And you have all those contrasts and conflicts. So yeah, that to me is perfect Doctor Who.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful story, and I'd love the fact that it doesn't answer every single question. I know that some people have complained about Ghostlight being confusing, but my God, it does not spoon feed, but nor should it. It makes you work as an audience member, and I think that's important. I think.
Well, I've always felt that people were just being a bit obtuse about Ghostlight, because I thought it was all perfectly clear. But then at a convention, somebody said something which opened my eyes, which was, they said, we thought Control, because they're called Control, should be in control. So that baffled us. I thought, oh, well, that makes unless you know what an experimental control is and what the function of an experimental control is, you'd completely get that character wrong. And you'd be expecting all kinds of things that don't happen. So there is scope for confusion. But the trouble is, you don't know what you don't know, or you do know what you do know. And I knew that was why Control was called Control. But the possibility of a different interpretation hadn't occurred to me. So there are reasons, and also it's a terribly rich story, and it's got a backstory. Like, all these aliens have come from somewhere else, and they've had a thing going on before they end up in this house. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having backstory, but I can see how it may be more confusing than a more straightforward tale.
And how much of the plotting of that season was down to you, and how much would have been down to the writers? Because that whole season is so beautifully set up with the Ace being challenged all the time. Was that something which you'd sat down with, and actually you would have mapped that season out as to how the characters should develop?
Well, we didn't map it out in exactly that way, because as actually happened, the shows were transmitted in a different sequence to what we'd conceived. So that just as well we didn't build in and cast iron a story arc. But yeah, what happened by then is that I had this team of writers who would come into the office and hang out together, not just with me, but with the other writers. So we could have these conversations. And Ian loved the fact that other writers of caliber were writing about Ace, and they wanted to know his thoughts about the character. And so we had Rona, and we had Ben, and we had Ian, and Mark Platt, and they were all talking to each other. So there was a chance for interaction, cross-pollination, and they knew what we were striving for. And there's this great thing that once you get that rolling, as a script editor, you can sort of sit back and let them work out the connections between survival and Ghostlight, and about the house burning down and all that stuff. And I'm just getting a bit of goosebumps now, because it's so great. And they're you couldn't find two better writers or two more different writers than Rona Munro and Mark Platt. And to have them sort of building something together is just fab. And so, yeah, so I'd love to take the credit for it all, but if I may take the credit, is for hiring these terrific writers and giving them the freedom to develop this stuff together, being smart enough not to get in the way, just to get in the way enough to sort of tell them what we needed, and let them start cooking up a wonderful meal.
And then the show was not cancelled, but not recommissioned, and it still hasn't been cancelled. I mean,
the spooky thing is, Ghostlight ends with the characters going into suspended animation. And that's kind of what happened to the show. And I'm not sure that isn't the last. I could be making this up, but I think that was the last thing we shot on Ghostlight. That was the last thing we shot on Doctor Who, sort of a metaphor for what happened to the show itself.
Yeah. Did you? I mean, Sophie says she didn't know, and Sylvester McCoy says he didn't know. Did you have an inkling that they weren't going to recommission? I'm just thinking because was your writing that final speech in Survival, and was that almost goodbye?
Yes, John told me, he didn't say it was goodbye, but John said something along the lines of, "We're not going to be coming back in a hurry, so we've got to do something here." Probably in his own mind, he was thinking that it really could be goodbye, but he was sort of sparing me that. He said, we need some kind of sign off here.
Right.
So Rona wasn't around, so I wrote that, And then I phoned her up and told her what we'd done, and she was sort of very generous about it. But nobody likes somebody else writing stuff in their scripts. But I'm very proud of that speech because it. You see, what I did there was, um, I looked at somebody who'd done a really great Doctor Who speech, which was Mark Platt, and it was in Ghostlight when he talks about burnt toast and empty bus stations.
Yeah.
Oh, I want some of that. So I did my own kind of take on that, which was to combine the cosmic with the tea getting cold. That was sort of a nod to Mark, and so I really enjoyed writing that, and it's great because you can go on YouTube and see David Tennant saying it or something like that. The only downside to that is they were doing a Doctor Who game. I think it was a Doctor Who Lego game. Anyway, they're doing a game and they wanted to use that speech. So they went to Rona to pay her for it. And she said, oh, that's not, I didn't write that. Andrew Cartmel wrote that, which is very noble of her. But the thing is, they said, oh, well, Andrew was staff at the BBC, so we don't have to pay him anything. So what she should have done is taken the money and, kept it herself, given it to me, given it to a cat charity, but not let the BBC off the hook. So she was honourable and doing the right thing. But in a way, it was the wrong thing because I just like to see writers get paid. I really do. But the point is, I wrote that speech because we knew that something was up. And I'm really glad I did because that speech has gone on to have a life of its own.
Absolutely. And obviously, your career continues. But how much credit do you feel that you should take? And I think it's a fair bit for the fact that when Doctor Who returned in 2005, essentially, it was as though that episode could have followed Survival with a few weeks later.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, Russell was very astute to see that the sort of council estate reality of Survival was like a perfect template to build New Who on. And Rose could have been Ace's sister, couldn't she? Yeah. So I think you're right. There's an almost seamless transition between our terrible, underfunded, unsuccessful show that everybody hated into the well-funded, hugely successful, adored Russell Davies era. Yes, you almost can't see the break between those two. You can't see the join. Yeah, but that's very true. And I didn't realize it when I first started watching New Who, or for years afterwards. But people sort of came up to me and said, "Look, this is just like the stuff you were doing. You made the template for it." And I'll take that. I think that's true. Yeah. But the great thing is I came along to Doctor Who and I saw a different way of doing it, which was modern and which was interesting and was unlike the old show, but honored all the essential virtues of the old show. So when it came back, I'm delighted that they built on it. I wouldn't mind the occasional royalty check, but as I said, I'm not in a position to receive that, even if that was on the cards, because I was guest staff at the BBC. But I'm delighted that that's what happened. And I'm even more delighted to get a bit of recognition, because who doesn't love a bit of recognition?
Absolutely, yes. But your career continued. So after Doctor Who, it would have been to Casualty for a year. Yep. And that there was a show that was respected within the BBC. Did you feel that you, as a script editor, gained more respect because you'd taken what must have been a step up in that department?
Yeah, Casualty was such hard work, and for a lot of reasons, not the least of which, and this is what I hate. There's a couple of things I hated about the show. One was the producer, who was well worth hating. But I mean, because with John, I'd had the best possible experience of working with a producer. To go on to Casualty, we had the worst possible experience. But setting that aside, the other thing I hated about Casualty, which is well worth hating, is that you get a script and you get the script exactly the way you wanted it. It then had to be, you didn't just have, the producer didn't have to sign off on it. There was also 3 separate medical experts, any one of whom, there was a nursing expert, get this right, an ambulance expert, and a doctor expert. And all 3 of them had to approve it for authenticity. And the ambulance guy and the nursing guy were usually fine, but the doctor could get really arsey. And like, what would happen is you would have your writers go off, and they would talk to other doctors that people worked in hospital, people, medical professionals, and they'd get the story that they loved, and they'd work it all out, and they'd write it. And then the doctor who was on the payroll said, "Oh, that could never happen. That could never happen." So it's just a nightmare, because you don't want anybody else to have that level of say on a script. You really don't. So it was a very unhappy experience, and I got canned basically at the end. They didn't renew my contract. So it was nothing. But the only good thing about it is I got some. I got to hire my writers, so they got paid for that. And also, I gave some writers who I'd wanted to give a break on Who but couldn't, like Tony Etchells and Robin Mukherjee. I was able to give them a break on Casualty, and they went on to write a lot of stuff for many years afterwards. So that was gratifying in a kind of
they two writers who you had are they two writers you had ready for the next season of Who? Because Robin's name I recognise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's such a shame that we didn't get to see it. Would you have stayed for that season?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd also like to mention Matthew Sanders, who's another terrific writer, who's still writing scripts now and is still in touch with me. But he'd sent in a terrific script called The Clockwork Cuckoo, so he's another guy. If I'd remained on the show long enough, I would love to have worked with him. So absolutely. Would I have stayed on? Yes. And what would have happened is that we would have continued to develop Sylvester, or, we kind of got him where we wanted him. We would have kept going in that way. And I love Sophie, and I thought Ace was one of the greatest companions ever. But we would have had Ace bow out and brought a new companion on. And Ben and Mark Platt, Ben Ronich and Mark Platt, had an idea that Ace should go off and join the Pridonian Academy. Have I got that right? I'm pretending I know about it. Yeah, and become a Time Lord or lady, and which would have been a great farewell bow for her. And we'd worked out a kind of new companion. And anybody who's interested in that, they can see a lot of that material or hear a lot of that material in the Big Finish. There's Lost. What's it called? Missing Adventures, Lost Adventures. Something like that. So there's a story called Crime of the Century. The reason I'm having trouble with titles is that I wasn't allowed to choose any of these titles, so I hate them. But Crime of the Century, Animal, and Earth Aid were the three that I was involved with writing, and they show they particularly show the, especially Crime of the Century, is useful to see what we would have done to introduce a new companion. So it's just for anybody out there who's curious about that.
Lovely, thank you. So, well, let's start to bring ourselves up to the present here, if we can. So, you are a writer. It's obviously in your bones. So, your current projects are towards theatre. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing now?
Given that the theatres are all closed until we don't know when, yes. I'll start by talking about my exciting series of crime novels.
Oh yes, yeah.
So I'm reaching forward to the coffee table. They're always there. It's not just so. I developed a character called the Vinyl Detective, and so that's the first book, written in dead wax. Very good book. This is the second book, even better. It's called The Run Out Groove. I love these. I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying this. Victory Disc, book 3. Book 4, Flip Back, and book 5, called Low Action, which refers to the way a guitar is strung, was due out in May, but because of events which you guys might be familiar with, it's been delayed until August the 5th. So, just very quickly, these are crime novels with a sense of humor. They've got recurrent characters whom I thought, if this series is going to be a success, it's because people will fall in love with the characters, and people have begun to fall in love with the characters. It's about a record collector turned sleuth. The reason I did that was because my friend Ben Aronovich has a series of books called the Rivers of London books. 2 million copies and more sold, and potentially a big TV series in the offing. So I said to Ben, what's the trick to being a successful writer? And he said, write about what you really love. Like, seriously, don't try and write what you think people will like. Write about what you really love. And I thought, well, I kind of love records, vinyl, jazz, searching for records in charity shops, to be perfectly honest. So I came up with the Vinyl Detective. I also love crime novels, crime fiction. So I came up with the Vinyl Detective, and it sort of worked. So it's what they call cozy crime, which means none of the main characters are likely to be disemboweled in Denmark and have their heads stuck on a post, like in the fashionable way. But yeah. So also, warning, may contain cats. So if you're allergic to cats, these books do contain cats. And I have to mention this too. On April the 17th, one of the novels, Flip Back, is Audible's Deal of the Day, which means it's the audiobook is going to be available cheap. So you don't even have to read the books to check out if you like them. You can get an incredibly marvelous economical deal on an audiobook. So give it a go. April the 17th.
That's wonderful. So so you've got this. You've got such a pedigree as a writer. So we've got TV, we've got obviously audio work, we've got the books, we've got comics,
Yeah.
we've got theatre. If you had to, which one is the one
Well,
which
the
you
thing
most
is,
enjoy?
as we were sort of discussing before we officially started recording this interview, there's something incredibly exciting about the theatre writing. And I like, as I say, every theatre in the country is shut and we don't know when it's going to be open. So this is a very funny time to find myself with several ideas for plays, which I'm passionately engaged in writing at the moment. It's a bit of a fool's errand, but I do really love that. On the other hand, I'm also working on a new novel because I've got a great idea for a novel and I'm doing the research for that. And that's sort of like hedging my bets in case the theatres don't open up quickly enough. But so that those are the two forms, I would say. The thing about a novel is that when you put it on the page, if it doesn't get interfered with, when it's in print or electronic or even read aloud, your ideas are going straight into the mind of the reader or of the listener. So there's no more direct form of communication. And for an artist, that's very exciting. It's a way to completely express yourself perfectly. Now, in the theater, you might have an actor who fucks up every single line in your play, because we've all had that. You know, it might just be because they could be a great actor. It might just be because they're unprepared, or maybe they're not right for the part. But on the other hand, you have actors who speak your lines and they had a whole new dimension to it, and it's goosebump time again. I had that with an actor. I'll tell you what the line was. It was just a gag. They were talking about World War One. This was a play set in the 1920s, and this guy was talking about World War One. And the gag was, somebody said, "Oh, the Great War," and so he said, "It's it wasn't so great. It's just a gag. It wasn't so great." But you see the way, and the actor is called James Sobol Kelly. He's a fantastic actor. The way he said it with such pathos. You knew that he'd been in that war and he'd had a hell of a time. Like he just added this whole world of meaning to this. Well, it wasn't that great. You know, those four words, and he invested it with this new universe of meaning. So that's kind of pretty exciting. So you don't get exactly what you wrote like you do in a novel, but sometimes you get way more. And also you get the excitement of collaboration. Collaboration can be a pain in the ass because sometimes think, why don't they just do it the way I want them to do it? But on the other hand, when it works, it's fabulous. And there's something very healthy about collaboration and working with other people, which I love. So I'm having a load of play readings online. And if this continues for a while, we might even throw it open to the public. We'll see how it goes.
Lovely. Do you enjoy the process of writing?
I love it. I love it. You know, it's the most fun I've had with my clothes on. Sometimes when I close off, if I start writing early enough in the day, that's a little too much information, I know. So picture me wearing a full dressed suit while I'm writing. I know, I just love it. And I love being in that state of mind where if somebody says something to me, like I'm not even all there, which may sound like an undesirable condition to be in, but no, it's a really desirable condition because your brain is so engaged in it. And it's just great. And when it's going well, there's nothing like it. To tell you what, Paul, there's nothing like getting that idea. You know, I remember when I knew I wanted to write a certain kind of play, a 1920s, 30s crime thriller set in an English country house, but I didn't have the idea. I remember where I was standing in the middle of the kitchen when the idea dropped into my head. It was fabulous. And the really exciting thing is, you start working on it doesn't have to be a play, it could be a novel, but in this case it's a play. You think, oh, well, that's a nice idea. I'm going to do that in the play. Then suddenly you think, hang on, if I do that, I can do this. And it's like it was always meant to be. But you think, wow, that actually sets up something I hadn't even imagined, which is fantastic. Yeah. So I love writing. Now, I don't know why anybody would want to do anything else, but thank God they do, because there's too much competition already. So, yeah.
Would you, final question then. If the call came through, would you write a script for contemporary Doctor Who?
Well, I'd love to, and not just for the obvious reason that it would be dosh and it would be a credit, but I have some ideas. And also I have that sense of unfinished business. So the answer is I would love to. I mean, who wouldn't?
Yeah. Lovely. Well, listen, it's genuinely been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. It really has. Thank you so much.
I didn't know what to expect, but it's been great. Thanks.
Well, it has. It's been lovely. Thank you very much indeed. So, thank you very much indeed for talking to me today. Andrew Cartmel, thank you.
Take care.